Before we Before we begin, I would like to inform you that as a result of some refurbishing that we have done with CLAMS, namely with this new web page and some technical difficulties that we experienced, the last two excellent lectures of Professor Derek Kennett of the University of Chicago and his erudite group of colleagues, as well as that of Professor James Howard Johnson of Oxford, both of whom I hope will be present here today, have not yet been uploaded on our webpage. The good news is, thanks to our administrative assistant, soon to be Dr. Malek Harb, we will be uploading them shortly, and we promise. So, uh, before go any further comment, I would like to introduce our new guest um, and welcome with great pleasure Professor Peter Vincent Sarris to CLAMS and thank him for honoring us really with his presence. I will say a brief words for those of you who didn't know Professor Sarris before, before I give the platform to him. Peter Vincent Sarris read modern history at Balliol College, Oxford from 1990 to 1993, after which he was elected to a prize fellowship by examination at All Souls College, Oxford. He moved to Cambridge in 2000, where he is now a professor of late antique, medieval, and Byzantine studies at the Faculty of History at Cambridge. As most of you must know, Peter has published extensively on the social, economic, and legal history of late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, and Byzantium, with a particular focus. Hello, I'm sorry, somebody's microphone is open. Please close your microphones. Thank you. Peter has published extensively on the social, economic, and legal history of late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, and Byzantium, with a particular emphasis and focus on the political economy of the East Roman Empire from the 4th to
Parvane, you're muted. Parvane, you're muted. Okay,
Yes,
now it's working.
Oh, from where was I muted?
Just
Did I introduce
just 2 seconds ago. Just 2 seconds ago. No worries.
Okay, okay. All right, here we go. So current research focuses on the development of Eurasian trading networks, my favorite, between Constantinople, Persia, Central Asia, and China, and also on the emergent contours of confessional state in the age of Justinian. He has also had a long-standing interest in the so-called plague of Justinian, the wave of bubonic plague that swept much of Eurasia in 6th century. Peter has published extensively on all these topics. His latest book of 544 pages, Justinian, Emperor, Soldier, and Saint, was a Sunday Times, London Evening Standard, BBC History magazine, and Süddeutsche Zeitung and Juristenzeitung Book of the Year, and has been awarded the prestigious International London Hellenic Prize for the best book published in English relating to or inspired by Hellenic civilization. He has been the winner, his book has been the winner of the London, I mean, it's really embarrassing. His book has been the winner of the London Hellenic Prize in 2024. He has been shortlisted for Runciman Award of 2024. And he has gotten great reviews of the book. Peter Frankopan, I hope I have uh, uh, pronounced it well, has called it a majestic, sparkling account of one of the most important rulers in history. Modern history writing at its finest. Simon Sebag has called it effortlessly erudite, lucidly written, with a sharp eye for the telling detail. Sarris has written the great biography of the greatest of the Byzantine emperors. And other colleagues have uh, have opined that this is the definitive life story of the Roman emperor, who shaped modern times. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Sarris to our lecture series. Peter, I give you the platform, and we are all ready for your talk.
Many thanks for the introduction and indeed for the invitation to speak to you today. My plan in this talk is essentially to draw on my experience of writing my recent book on Justinian to consider how best to approach and make sense of the emperor and how best to appreciate his legacy. The reign of Justinian, a medieval English depiction of whom you see on the screen in front of you, has long stood out from the pages of ancient and medieval history for its energy, ambition, and drama, and for the emperor's crucial role in bestriding the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages and re-intensifying connections between East and West. From the imperial capital of Constantinople, Justinian ruled over a vast domain, which at the start of his reign in 527 extended from Greece and the Balkans in the west to the deserts of Syria and Arabia to the east. Yet for all its apparent grandeur, the empire that Justinian inherited from his uncle, the Emperor Justin I, in 527, was one arguably haunted by a profound sense of anxiety, failure, and insecurity, which the new emperor was determined to address. Now, a chief, although by no means the sole cause of anxiety, was the fact that, although Justinian claimed to be Roman emperor, sole heir and successor to the emperors Augustus and Constantine, his was, of course, a Roman empire that no longer embraced the empire's original heartlands of Africa, Italy, Spain, and Gaul. Along with Britain, these lands had been lost to direct Roman rule over the course of the preceding century. So glorious and extensive as it was, the Roman Empire of Justinian's day was already understood by some to be an imperial contradiction. And prior to Justinian's reign, chroniclers such as the pagan Zosimus had begun to comment on this fact. In response to this, relatively early on in his reign, Justinian would famously spearhead an imperial reconquest of Africa, Italy, and ultimately part of Spain, which had been lost to direct imperial rule. His campaign began in 533 with the daring decision to send an expeditionary force to the Vandal kingdom of Africa. The areas that would be reconquered are marked in purpley pink on the map on the screen in front of you. With the rapid defeat in battle and then capture of the Vandal kingdom, King Gelimer, the entire kingdom passed back into Roman hands. The breathtaking success of this African mission would soon encourage Justinian to direct his armies into Italy in a concerted effort to restore Roman rule over the ancient crucible of empire. This attempt, too, would prove largely successful. In Italy, however, Justinian's armies met much more concerted resistance, and the result, some have argued, would be to inflict much greater damage on the fabric of the reconquered territories, including the city of Rome itself, than the supposed barbarian invaders of the 5th century had ever managed. At home, Justinian cracked down on tax evasion by members of the senatorial elite who repeatedly schemed and plotted against him, and also dramatically overhauled the inherited body of Roman law. His aim here was to impose order and clarity on the sprawling mass of legal texts upon which the administration and regulation of the empire depended, facilitating thereby speedier justice and reforming the law to express one unified vision and will, that of the emperor himself, such as we find contained in his codex, his digest, and his institutes. So effective was this act of autocratic fiat and codification that it's now extremely difficult to work out in any real detail what Roman law was like before Justinian, with the emperor's law commissioners determining the form in which civil law would survive into the Middle Ages and beyond, providing the bedrock for what the Roman lawyer Barry Nicholas described as the common law of Christian Europe. Whilst locked in political conflict with members of this elite, many of whom resented his legal as well as his fiscal reforms, Justinian attempted to appeal to the broader populace of Constantinople by investing in lavish building projects, epitomised, of course, by Hagia Sophia, and by engaging in prodigious acts of generosity and charity, primarily targeted at the urban poor. But above all, as I've recently sought to emphasise, Justinian sought to recast the Roman Empire, transforming it into a more fully Christian state, completing the work of Christianization initiated by Constantine, a more fully Christian state in which religious outsiders, dissidents, and those deemed morally or sexually deviant were subjected to ever more draconian punishments. As churchmen deemed heretical saw their writings burnt on the streets and were themselves consigned to prison or exile, and as the emperor's many Jewish subjects found themselves openly discriminated against by state officials with active imperial encouragement, it would have become increasingly apparent to many contemporaries that the accession of Justinian had heralded the advent of a more intolerant age. To some of his enemies, he was a demon. To some of his admirers, he would be regarded as a saint. But to a broader body of his contemporaries, whether they viewed him as a holy emperor or a demon king, it would have been clear that Justinian was a ruler of remarkable vision and drive, one who, as Fiona Hara has emphasised, reigned longer than any Roman emperor, with the sole exceptions of Augustus and Theodosius II. Now, it's often emphasised, it was emphasised by my friend and colleague, the late Mark Whitto, that Justinian helped to lay the foundations for the world of Orthodox Byzantium as it took shape in the centuries ahead. In many ways, however, I would argue that his achievement was more fundamental than that. In his recasting of the Roman state as an Orthodox republic, as he described it in one of his laws to which we shall return, Justinian ultimately laid the ideological and psychological foundations for medieval Christendom as a whole, as well as bequeathing a major legacy to the Islamic world that emerged in the Near East in the 7th and 8th centuries. In each case, the legacy of Justinianic law would inform how rulers interacted with their subjects, and in particular, how they treated religious minorities. Many of the great persecutions we associate with the world of medieval Christendom, for example, were in a fundamental way informed by what used to be thought of as the rediscovery and renewed application of Justinianic Roman law from around the 11th century. On a much more general level, moreover, as Mike Humphreys has emphasised, through his energetic reform programme and his no less energetic self-glorification, Justinian recast what it meant to rule, providing a model of statecraft to which future Byzantine emperors, medieval kings, and even Ottoman sultans would come to aspire. Now, we're fortunate with respect to the age of Justinian that the emperor's military adventures in particular would be captured for posterity by the contemporary historian Procopius of Caesarea, who famously accompanied Justinian's favoured general Belisarius on his Persian, African, and Italian campaigns, whilst also bequeathing to posterity both the scandalous Secret History, first edition of which I show you on the screen in front of you, and the largely encomiastic buildings, in which the emperor's construction projects were celebrated. As the late Cyril Mango used to emphasise, Procopius was arguably one of the 4 greatest historians to write in the Greek language at any point in its long history. Yet for anyone attempting to come to terms with the 6th century, the writings of Procopius are both a blessing and a curse, in that Procopius so overshadows his subject that it becomes very difficult to write a history of Justinian's reign that isn't simply a rehashing of Procopius's narrative, or which views Justinian through Procopius's largely classicizing and military lens. And so one challenge I set myself in writing my recent book was to try, insofar as possible, to break free from Procopius, whilst also allowing the great historian his due and using him where appropriate. In doing so, I was of course fortunate to be able to draw on the work of others, such as Averell Cameron, whose pioneering work on Procopius in the 1980s did so much to elucidate the complexities of his various compositions, Anthony Caldelis coming at Procopius from a very different perspective, and also Roger Scott, whose foundational work on the Chronicle of John Manalas revealed the extent to which, even within the 6th century bureaucratic and military elite, perceptions of what was truly significant about Justinian's reign could vary so much. So Manalas wasn't really terribly interested in the Western reconquests. But in particular, I took my lead from a theologian, the late John Meyendorff, and from a Roman lawyer, the late Tony Honoré, a colleague of mine in All Souls, from whom I learned what we might term the opportunity cost of the extent to which Procopius's primarily military focus has tended to inform approaches to Justinian at the expense of consideration of both the vast body of legislation and the theological texts to which Justinian contributed that survive from his reign. For crucially, the Procopian perspective has, I would suggest, too often led historians to understate Justinian's contribution in the two areas in which the emperor and those around him were arguably at their most creative, namely law and theology. As a result, I would suggest, many have often failed to grasp the true significance of Justinian's reign. For these two areas of major creativity were ones with respect to which Procopius was fundamentally either hostile or just disinterested with regard to Justinian and his reign. Consequently, I decided to try and take my lead from Justinian's own pattern of activity at court insofar as we could recreate it, rather than Procopius's response to such activity or his own experiences on the military front line. Trying to get a sense of the emperor and his reign by reading his laws and legislation as a whole in chronological order, alongside his contemporary theological interventions, again in chronological order, and placing them in their contemporary military, political, social, and economic context, drawing on the chronicles, histories, and documentary papyri. And I came away from doing so with a very different sense of the nature of Justinian's priorities, and above all, the nature of his legacy and achievement. Now, Justinian's Western military ventures and foreign policy typically loom large in accounts of his reign, such as the excellent recent book on Justinian by Peter Heather. And this is not of itself unreasonable. All Roman emperors felt under an obligation to defend and, where possible, to extend the contours of the Roman state, and Justinian was in that sense no different. But the Western campaigns, which so often capture the imagination of Western historians, were largely, I have argued, exercises in what I have termed opportunistic imperialism, taking advantage of a series of internal political crises in the emergent successor kingdoms of Africa, Italy, and Spain. These were opportunities which Justinian was fortunate to be presented with, resultant from crises he and his court clearly helped to foster. But we have almost no indication of any great preconceived plan to reconquer the West as a whole, and the commitment of military resources to the West was always relatively limited. Likewise, this same Western focus has often led historians to repeat the claim that Justinian neglected the defense of the East for his adventures to the West. But again, for Justinian, as indeed for almost all East Roman emperors of late antiquity, containing threats from the East was almost always the first priority. In terms of state investment and military priorities, there was rather a deep-rooted continuity in terms of the prioritization of Persia and the adoption with respect to the Shahs of Iran of a policy of what Geoffrey Greatrex has described as aggressive defensiveness, an approach which characterized the Roman response to its great Eastern foe after the sudden re-emergence of Roman-Persian warfare in the year 502, after a century of détente. And I think that re-emergence of Roman-Persian warfare in the year 502 is one of the two most important events of the entirety of the 6th century. So emphasising Justinian's foreign policy is fine, so long as we approach it in the round with a view to both East and West. What is, I think, rather more problematic is a tendency to judge the ultimate success or otherwise of Justinian's reign in terms of the subsequent military history of the empire in general and the subsequent military history of the reconquered territories to the west in particular. By the time of Justinian's death in 565, as indicated earlier, his armies had reconquered Italy, Africa, and part of Spain. And importantly, the Justinian authorities had been obliged to acknowledge Roman overlordship in the strategically vital West Caucasian kingdom of Lazica. By the 570s, however, much of northern Italy had come to be overrun by a new barbarian threat in the form of the Lombards. By the end of the 620s, East Roman forces had been driven out of Spain, and Roman territories in Africa, as well as in Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, would succumb to the Arabs over the course of the 7th century. At the same time, the reigns of Justinian's immediate successors would witness growing fiscal frailty on the part of the East Roman state, which would in turn lead to military unrest, growing political instability, and ultimately a civil war, which opened the way to Persian invasion. Now, it's been common for historians to try to establish some sort of causal connection between Justinian's imperial expansion and the subsequent era of imperial collapse. But the fiscal and military exhaustion of the empire that we start to see signs of in the late 6th century is far more likely to have been a result of the repeated bouts of the devastating bubonic plague, which first struck the empire in the 540s and which would recur down to the 8th century. On the screen in front of you are some victims of a 6th century plague outbreak in eastern England, in a village about 25 minutes walk from where I'm sitting at the moment in Cambridgeshire. Likewise, the Lombard invasions were ultimately, in part at least, the result of a reconfiguration of power in Central Asia in the mid-6th century, which had led to the migration of the Avars, the consolidation of whose power to the north of the Danube would encourage both Lombards and Slavs to cross into imperial territory in Italy and the Balkans respectively, so as to escape Avar overlordship. That reconfiguration of power in Central Asia in the mid-6th century, possibly associated with the coterminous disruption in the environment that is recorded at that point. But still more problematically, overemphasizing the relatively short-lived nature of Justinian's revival of imperial fortunes in the West when thinking about the legacy of his reign is to misunderstand where those wars stood in terms of Justinian's own list of priorities. Rather, if we want to get to grips with Justinian's real priorities, we need to essentially set aside the military writings of Procopius and turn instead to the evidence of the emperor's own personal actions and interventions and the life of the court. Viewed from that perspective, the emperor's overriding interests lay in the fields of law and legal reform and the definition and propagation of the Christian faith. To take law first, there is sometimes a tendency for historians of the age of Justinian to associate the extraordinary legal creativity and activism of his reign primarily with the figure of Tribonian, who served as his quaestor, or chief legal officer, and who was undoubtedly a driving force in the codification project, rescuing the Codex after the initial recension of it proved to be problematic, presiding over the compilation of the digest, and directing and editing the institutes. Tribonian presided over the last and perhaps the greatest efflorescence of Roman jurisprudence, and after his death in 542, imperial legislation diminished considerably in volume. But the contribution of Tribonian was informed above all by the fact that his extraordinary talent appealed to and chimed with the interests of the emperor. It was akin, in other words, to the way in which Justinian's fiscal interests and agenda chimed with the priorities and skill set of John the Cappadocian. But in order to appreciate this, we have to take a step back and look at Justinian before he became sole emperor. Thanks to the work of Brian Croke, we can chart in detail Justinian's career prior to his becoming sole emperor in the August of 527, when he succeeded his elderly uncle Justin to the throne. For the preceding 4 months, Justinian had ruled alongside Justin as co-emperor. Now, contrary to how Procopius presented him, Justin I had never been lax when it came to matters of legislation. And the number of extant laws issued per year during his reign is comparable with the legal output under his predecessor Anastasius. But the rate of output and tone of Justin's legislation, however, can be seen to have changed dramatically once Justinian was appointed co-emperor, such that 1/3 of all the laws we have for Justin's reign were issued in just those 4 months alone. Having spent almost 9 years of his life watching his adopted father running the Roman state at a relatively leisurely pace, Justinian was clearly determined to speed things up. Here was a middle-aged man in a hurry, determined to finally make his mark. So in just 1 month after he became sole emperor, the June of 528, for example, Justinian issued more extant laws than his uncle had done in the entirety of his 8.5-year period of sole rule. And whilst Justin had issued some 30 extant laws from 519 to 527, during the first 8 years of his reign, Justinian would issue over 400, many of them prior to the emergence of his working relationship with Tribonian. This initial wave of legislation addressed the full range of issues that had long concerned Roman emperors. But Justinian's overwhelming focus, however, was religious. The first clearly dated laws that survived from 528 forbade bishops from having children or grandchildren and regulated the running of hospices, infirmaries, poorhouses and orphanages under ecclesiastical care. It also cracked down on bribery to secure church appointments and complained of priests paying others to perform their duties for them, including conducting church services. Now, Justin believed in the imperial church and had a clear sense of its purpose and function within the overarching imperial system. However, he was under no illusions as to the moral failings of many of the church's personnel and was determined to engage in a catharsis of it. Justinian's initial religious ire, however, was overwhelmingly directed at heretics, Samaritans, and especially at this point, pagans. Emperors since the late 4th century had passed increasingly draconian legislation seeking to prohibit public acts of pagan worship and other practices associated with paganism, such as astrology. In an important law, probably issued in 529, as the late Alan Cameron emphasised, Justinian made it illegal not only to perform pagan rituals or rites, but even to be a pagan. Those who were found to have made only false or nominal conversions from what he termed the insanity of the unholy pagans to Christianity were to be subjected to the ultimate punishments, which in Justinian's legislation generally meant death. Those who failed to convert were to be exiled. Those caught performing pagan rites could be killed. This was the most extreme anti-pagan legislation that any Christian emperor had ever passed. This crackdown on religious nonconformists would then further intensify in the 530s, as in his so-called novels, his legislation issued after the codification, Justinian extended the scope of his legislation and decided to reclassify as heretics opponents of the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon of 451, whose orthodoxy he had previously accepted. Like pagans, Justinian decreed that Samaritans, heretics, and Jews were to be banned from holding any post in the imperial administration or army, and limitations were placed on their ability to receive inheritances or pass on property to non-Christian heirs. Nor could they own Christian slaves, teach, or give evidence in court against Christians unless it was on behalf of and in the interests of the government. Ominously for his Jewish subjects, in the Codex Justinianus, Justinian had dropped the provision in imperial law which had granted Judaism the status of a legally permitted religion or legal sect. Previous Roman emperors, though rhetorically often very anti-Jewish, had nevertheless issued laws that ultimately protected the emperor's Jewish subjects. Justinian now removed that legal cover, and his subsequent laws included measures aimed at sowing discord within the Jewish community and destabilizing relations between its members. Justinian's targeting of religious nonconformists also proceeded against a broader assault on those whose activities were deemed injurious to public morality and hence risked inciting divine wrath. So, for example, the emperor felt obliged to exhort his subjects in a constitution on blasphemies, Novel 77, to fear God and emulate those who chose to live rightly. For, he warned, it was because of offences such as these that famines, earthquakes, and plagues occur. The spate of earthquakes, famines, and outbreaks of bubonic plague that would characterise the emperor's reign would, of course, only serve to reinforce this crackdown, which also included legislation against those who recruited and exploited prostitutes or who engaged in homosexual acts, as well as against actors and actresses who dressed up as priests and nuns for the entertainment and titillation of their clients. Now, such legislation concerned with personal morality was also characterised by a very strong focus on the domestic sphere and the family. Justinian's legislation on marriage in particular placed an unprecedented emphasis on the permanence of marriage and the indissolubility of the marital bond, rewarding both men and women who chose to remain celibate after the death of their spouse, as Justinian seemingly did after the death of Theodora in 548. In a law of 538, the emperor for the first time introduced procedures for marriages to be sworn, witnessed, and registered at church. And in Novel 117, he amended earlier legislation contained in the Codex to permit judges to levy the death penalty for adultery. In a law of 542, he imposed severe penalties on those who chose to dissolve their marriages, even through mutual consent. And in the same constitution and in a later law, he went on to impose on first women and then men who sought to obtain divorce without just cause the novel penalty of life imprisonment in a monastery. Legislation has been excellently studied by Julia Hillner. Across the entirety of his legislation, Justinian effectively engaged in a concerted programme to recast the Roman Empire and to transform it into what historians today would think of as a confessional state. The opening volume of the Codex Justinianus, in marked contrast to the 5th century Codex Theodosianus, gave pride of place to laws concerned with the most exalted Trinity and the Catholic faith. It was only once the right to concerns of the Church had been addressed that the Codex could proceed to detail those of the state at large. Justinian sought to transform the Roman Empire into a state that was officially Christian, not only in terms of its ideology and official pronouncements, but also in terms of its interaction with its subjects. He progressively advanced the rights of those most lawful of the emperor's subjects who upheld the imperially sanctioned definition of the faith, whilst curtailing and applying steady downward pressure on the rights of religious and other minorities who were to be regarded as outsiders in his new Orthodox Republic. Under Justinian, the legal rights of the empire's citizens were increasingly determined by their officially reckoned degree of religious conformity. Deliberate efforts were thus made to marginalise the heterodox and to treat heretics, Jews, and Samaritans as a sort of undifferentiated mass of second-class citizens, increasingly burdened with obligations rather than bearing rights. In the law of 537, which described the empire as an Orthodox republic, Novel 45, for example, upper-class heretics, Samaritans, and Jews were henceforth to be subject to physical punishments which had previously been reserved for members of the lower classes in Roman society, the humiliores. Justinian declared, "The law allows city councillors numerous privileged exemptions, such as from being beaten or produced for punishment or deported to another province, and many others. But these people are to enjoy none of them. Their status is to be one of disgrace, which is what they have desired for their souls as well." Of course, as has often been emphasised, Such legislation was in many ways highly rhetorical. Not every upper-class Jew would have been beaten as a result of it. But given the highly anti-Jewish tone of much early Byzantine patristic literature in circulation at this time, literature which is likely to have both reflected and informed Christian opinion and practice, it is hard to believe that some would not have been. As with Justinian's anti-pagan legislation, where the instincts of bishops and governors aligned with the agenda of Justinianic law, there would have been a great deal of scope for the application of that law on the ground. The specific exemptions from imperial legislation that we encounter being granted by Justinian to particular groups, such as the Jewish community near Tyre, for example, which we find elsewhere in the novels, only makes sense against a much broader background of actual application of the Justinianic law. And even where legislation was arguably at its most rhetorical in intent, moreover, such rhetoric was clearly meant to serve a practical purpose. In 551, for example, Justinian agreed to formally restore a number of legal rights to the large Samaritan population of the city of Caesarea in Palestine, namely the ability to inherit, to make wills, and leave property to heirs of their choice under the full protection of the law. He'd been petitioned to grant this concession, Justinian tells us, by the local bishop in recognition of improved relations between the Samaritans and the representatives of the imperial government in the town. Interestingly, Justinian adds that in Caesarea, at least, the earlier legislation curtailing such rights had never, in fact, been fully implemented. No Samaritan estates had yet been confiscated by officers of the crown, as the law had permitted. So why was the law issued? As Baudouin Sarris has recently argued, such legislation perhaps makes sense as part of a campaign of psychological terror aimed at members of the Samaritan and other nonconformist elites, which sought to publicly shame and demoralize them, and to encourage conversion by seeking to inculcate a sense of legal insecurity within their ranks. The right to order succession to one's estate by means of a written will was highly prized in Roman elite culture. To be publicly seen to lose that right would have been regarded as utterly humiliating. The rhetoric was thus meant to stigmatize, demoralize, and cajole. Likewise, there can be no doubt that Justinian manipulated and altered the definition of heresy in his legislation, using it as a weapon with which to try to cajole recalcitrant Christian communities into conformity, expanding the definition of heresy to embrace the great Miaphysite theologian Severus and his followers, for example, in Novel 43, despite having previously accepted their orthodoxy when attempting to negotiate with the Severan party in the period from 532 to 534. Was this expansion of the definition of heresy too largely rhetorical? It clearly was to at least some degree, as Justinian would continue to seek to reach out to moderate anti-Chalcedonians and even some followers of Severus down to the very end of his reign. But there can be little doubt that practical efforts were also made to try to crack down on heretics, as Justinian would have understood them to be, on the ground. Just as we know from epigraphic evidence from Sardis, the trials of pagans did indeed take place. A law dating from 535, for example, concerned with provincial administration, alludes purely incidentally to what the emperor terms heretic hunting as a now entirely standard feature of life within the provinces of the empire. Importantly, as Norman Underwood has emphasised, ecclesiastical officials known as church defenders or defensores ecclesiae were now empowered to arrest, cross-examine and torture individuals suspected of paganism, heresy and immorality. In many ways, through such legislation, Justinian effectively established and defined the ideological foundations of the Christian state on which subsequent medieval rulers would build, especially through the medium of the revived Roman law from the 11th century onwards, delineating through his legislation the overarching vision of a Christian society presided over and disciplined by a pious monarch, in which deviance and error were to be ruthlessly extirpated or suppressed. Such legislation is also likely to have been an influence on the emergence of the dhimmi system in the world of the Caliphate. Perhaps most striking, however, is the way the emperor again sought to target the domestic roots of nonconformist belief. By prioritising the claims of Orthodox Christian heirs to inherit the property of their non-Orthodox or non-Christian relatives, for example, he sought to set father against son and pit sibling against sibling. The final victory of Christianity, Justinian evidently believed, was to be secured not just at the level of the state, but rather at the level of the household and the family within each and every town and village of his realm. Now, Justinian's legal output, as I mentioned earlier, would appear to have gone into relative decline from the early 540s. This may have been due to the death of Tribonian. It may have been due to a measure of institutional torpor resultant from the impact of the bubonic plague, or it may have been because the emperor's efforts became increasingly concentrated on matters of theology and doctrine. For the one interest, and I cannot emphasize this enough, that runs as an absolutely uniting thread through the entirety of Justinian's career, including the period before he was emperor, is that of Christology and attempting to resolve the doctrinal disputes that divided the imperial church. Although Justinian's position on individual theological issues can be seen to have wavered and evolved over time, his interest was constant. Even prior to ascending the imperial throne, for example, when he was simply the son or nephew, adopted son or nephew of a new emperor with no particular power at court, we see him writing to Pope Hormisdas in Rome, attempting to engage him in discussion of theology, quoting St. Augustine to him, and even reassuring the no doubt somewhat confused Pope that he regarded a statement recently made by him to be fully Catholic. After his accession to the throne, we see him convening discussions between supporters and opponents of the Council of Chalcedon in 532, almost brokering a deal with Severus and his supporters before moving against them in the mid-530s, and then carefully preparing the theological groundwork for the Council of Constantinople of 553, at which he would humiliate the hapless Pope Vigilius. Justinian's efforts to reach out to opponents of the Council of Chalcedon would continue into the 560s, when he engaged in discussion of controversial Aphthartis doctrine, which was becoming entrenched in the region of Armenia, where the emperor was attempting to extend imperial control. As Charippus describes Justinian's nephew and successor, Justin II, to have declared of the emperor upon his death in 565, all his mind was fixed on heaven. Indeed, later in life, and after the death of Theodora, Justinian had, in certain respects, adopted the persona of a Christian holy man. And as Averil Cameron noted, Charippus describes the emperor's corpse in his account of the imperial funeral as if it were a holy relic. So Justinian did not manage to bring peace to the imperial church. We all know this. But as Phil Booth has recently emphasised, he did manage to drive from episcopal office almost every opponent of imperial orthodoxy. This would be true even in Egypt, where resistance to the Council of Chalcedon had been at its fiercest. Likewise, he did not manage to extirpate non-Christians from the Roman state, but he did manage to fundamentally redefine the contours of imperial society, just as he and his law commissioners had recast the body of imperial law. He would also help to transform the world beyond the empire and on its fringes. As Michel Saltzman has recently emphasised, for example, one of Justinian's more paradoxical legacies to the world of the Middle Ages would be his building up of the institution of the papacy. For although he had humiliated Pope Vigilius at the Council of 553, in the so-called pragmatic sanction with which he sought to restore legal order to Italy in 554, Justinian had treated the Pope, and not the Senate of Rome, as his real representative and only significant interlocutor, not only with respect to Italy, but also, intriguingly, with respect to what Justinian describes as all known inhabitants of the West. So to conclude, in my first publication, over 20 years ago, a narrative chapter in Cyril Mango's Oxford History Byzantium, in which I was given the period from Constantine to Heraclius, I wrote of how, despite the grandeur of Justinian's project, buffeted by plague, frustrated by deeply entrenched social and religious realities, a reign that had promised so much ultimately ended in disappointment. I would not write those words now. For although with the benefit of historical hindsight, Justinian's Western reconquests may have been relatively short-lived, in terms of what mattered most to the emperor, law and theology, his legacy would be much more enduring. He redefined how both imperial law and Christian doctrine would be received in the Middle Ages, and he provided his successors to the throne of Constantinople with a model of active, pious rulership to which to aspire. But it was primarily through his works that the emperor's legacy would be felt, and it was arguably in the world of the Latin West, in the later Middle Ages, that Justinian's vision of a truly Christian society would be most fully and aggressively realised. In one crucial respect, this would prove to be bitterly ironic. For the tomb in which Justinian was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles in 565 was not ransacked, as one might imagine, when Mehmed the Conqueror destroyed the building after his capture of Constantinople in 1453. Rather, it had already been pillaged in 1204, when crusaders from the west had sacked the city. The contemporary Byzantine author Nikitas Choniatis would describe the scene as the Westerners smashed open the tomb. Finding that the corpse of Justinian had not decomposed through the long centuries, they looked upon the spectacle as a miracle, but this in no way prevented them from laying their hands on the tomb's valuables. In other words, the Western nations spared neither the living nor the dead, but beginning with God and his servants, they displayed complete indifference and irreverence to all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for what is really what was really a tour de force on Justinian. I'm sorry that my connection doesn't seem to be that great. I have a number of questions for you, which have to do with the spread of paganism and heterodoxy in the Byzantine Empire that caused the reforms of Justinian. I am especially interested in the trade interests of Justinian, especially with the East. And I'm also wondering whether or not the reforms of Khosrow the First, as some have sort of argued, were these reforms, were they influencing Khosrow the First in making his reforms? But please keep those in mind, because I want us to first go to our audience, and for one thing, I want Malakjan, if anybody is want to come online, to show their faces, please show them if they are online. So we're going to open the discussion, Peter, and see what this great group of colleagues that have gathered to listen to you have to say. Please. Anyone? Okay. So Peter, so why don't we start with my my questions? Can you tell us first about this is more than 2 centuries after Constantine, and it is it is the time that we are told that Christianization was on the rise and implemented and whatnot, and so I'm wondering, 2 centuries after the fact, what was the religious sort of panorama of Byzantium that necessitated such reforms from Justinian? Maybe we can start with.
Yeah, I think there are two aspects here. I think for Justinian, religious catharsis of the empire is the necessary prerequisite for imperial success. So for the empire to overcome the diminution in military and political circumstances which he regards it to have suffered, he blames the indolence of his predecessors. This is a repeated theme in his legislation. And as I say, I think, and the need for moral catharsis within the empire. And in that sense, the crackdown on pagans is akin to the crackdown on those who he regards as morally deviant in sexual terms, and the crackdown on those who do not believe correctly. So I think that as it were, it needn't be the case, for example, that there are very large or significant numbers of pagans still in the empire for him to regard a crackdown on paganism to be necessary. And I have always tended to come at this very much from the same sort of position that Alan Cameron did, that really by the time we're getting into the early 6th century, the paganism is what we would call pagan, what he would think of as paganism, is really a sort of a busted flush, and that even in educated circles, it's much weaker than some others have recently tried to suggest. But now, having said that, I think that is what is very important, however, is it is quite clear that on the streets of the big cities of the empire, particularly Constantinople, there is a very clear perception on the part of many members of the urban population that the Roman elite is replete with crypto-pagans. And these are these more sort of hard-line elements within the church, and these elements on the streets of the imperial capital and cities are very much part of Justinian's support base. So I think he's tapping into this perception, which we also see very much in the politics of his successor Justin II, of there being sort of coteries of crypto-pagans in the Roman establishment, whether they're there or not. That's very widely believed. But what makes me reconsider my position to some extent was a really very important finding unveiled by the Byzantine archaeologists in Oxford recently, who had been out excavating at Aphrodisias. And in Aphrodisias, they have found what appears to be a fully functioning underground pagan place of worship, which appears to have only gone out of activity at the time of the Persian attack in 616. Replete with statues and votive offerings and things. But literally an underground temple. So it's built underground, as it were. So if those sorts of communities are able to hold on in Asia Minor into the early 7th century, then maybe there are, in fact, maybe this isn't all in the imagination of the mobs on the streets and the more hardline elements within the church. So you seem to have turned your microphone off.
Yes. A follow-up on that, Peter. Do you think that was there a rise in monasteries, considering the fact that you say that there was, these extreme controls on marriages imposed on the population? Did the rise of monasteries have to do anything with this?
Well, monasteries, I mean, what Justinian is, I think once again, Justinian's vision of Roman society is one in which ecclesiastical institutions and religious institutions are being bound much more into the workings of the state. So over the course of his reign, for example, a number of responsibilities that would previously have been associated with the figure of the defensor civitatis, an institution that Justinian tries to build up, end up being devolved instead to bishops. Likewise, one can see that in Egypt, for example, that just as secular institutions like city councils or great estates have quite a lot of fiscal responsibility devolved to them, so increasingly are monasteries. And I think this growing use of monasteries in the context of criminal law and punishment and moral correction, which is very much bound up with criminal law, is part of that, both his vision for religious catharsis and his vision for, as it were, breaking down all remaining barriers between religious institutions and the realm of the state. To go back to two of the points, however, you raised initially, the Persian dimension, so before I don't want to forget those. First of all, I mean, I think I said that I think that the revival of warfare with Persia in 502 is one of the two great events of the 6th century. I think the other one being the advent of the bubonic plague. I think it's very interesting that after the revival of warfare with Persia, we see in the 530s both Justinian and Khusro I engaging in what appear to be in many ways parallel processes of internal reform, fiscal upgrading, administrative upgrading of their respective empires. And I think that this is a phenomenon which is very similar to that which you encounter, say, in the context of Europe in the 17th century, in the context of the military revolution, whereby military competition between states that obliged them to upgrade their fiscal machinery. I think the two great empires of Western Eurasia are engaged in similar parallel programs of reform due to the consequences and the anticipated consequences of this revival of superpower warfare on a grand scale, a topic I studied with James Howard Johnston, your previous speaker, when I was a student. So I think there's an element of emulation there, but in a sense, I think because the two empires are being pushed towards internal reform by the same objective military circumstances. Trade policy, I think, is much more interesting because I've been very influenced by the work of Richard Payne and the emphasis that Richard has placed on the active role of the Sasanian monarchy, not just and of Central Asian nomadic states and rulers, not just in terms of seeking to benefit from trade, say through taxation, in the way that the Roman state had always done, or long done, but actually by being active participants in trade through forming alliances with particular trading communities, by building up and investing in mercantile districts of cities and what have you. And I think that this sees Justinian engaging in something very similar. That is most obvious in his policy with respect to the stealing of the secrets of silk production. But from the 540s onwards, we also see important shifts in imperial policy towards monopolistic practices. Again, I think the empire forging alliances, the imperial authorities forging alliances with specific mercantile groups. And I interpret that as a deliberate emulation of Sasanian policy. I think Justinian is trying to emulate Sasanian trade policy in that respect, particularly from the 540s. So you turned off your microphone again. Sorry.
I have a follow-up, but just remember this because there is another question. I'm wondering whether the wars between Byzantium and Sasanians during the 6th century were trade-based wars, because the peace treaties that was made between 6th century in 6th century and later on was emphasized trade quite a bit, and emphasized and somehow pinpointed brought to the surface the Jewish participation in trade and the Arab participation in trade. Do you agree with that or not? Just don't answer me, because there is another question. Please remember that, and I want to go to the audience, please. Peter, there is Michael Scarlatus. Michael, you can speak up, Michael, if you so wish. If you wish. Okay. But anyway, his question is: was Justinian considered a foreigner by local Constantinopolians?
I think he is, well, in the Constantinople of his day, of course, the area of the Balkans he's coming from has long been a major military recruiting ground. And as a result, many of the military emperors of the preceding period and lots of soldiers on the streets of Constantinople and many of the officer corps were coming from a similar geographical milieu. So I don't think that, so he's from a sort of part of the world from which, there were going to be lots of people on the streets of Constantinople coming from the same geographical milieu. But I think that it's not so much people on the streets. I think it's that members of the more aristocratic end of the spectrum of political society clearly regard him and his family as carpet-bagging semi-barbarians. He's coming. Justinian's family are coming from one of the least urbanized, least Romanized parts of the Roman world. But they're also coming clearly with a very strong sense of Roman identity. And I think a particular, I think that these people of Illyrian military background, who have seen, as it were, as we can see, the region around Justinian's hometown of Justiniana Prima, a region really devastated by the military consequences of barbarian invasion across the 5th century, I think, are particularly sensitive to the issue of the loss of Roman control in the West. They are particularly anti-barbarian in terms of the Western barbarians. They would think of them in political outlook. And they're also particularly committed to the reunification of ecclesiastical relations with Rome. But I don't think they would have been regarded as semi-barbarians by members of the aristocratic elite, but I don't think they'd have been regarded as outlandish on the streets of Constantinople by most Constantinopolitans.
Thank you.
Parvani, we have 2 questions. 2 people have their hands raised, Alison and Scott, and a question in the chat from Francis. Do you want to go by order? Sorry, Parvani, let me unmute you.
Yes, please. And there is a question in chat also, Malek John. Yeah, please. I have not followed it, so you go by order, please.
Their hand up first, then Scott, then Francis. So let's start with Alison's question.
Sure.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading the book now. Sorry that I haven't, so my questions might actually kind of be answered, and that's kind of what I'm asking. I have 2 questions. One was that basically I very much appreciated your comments about questioning what we lose by focusing so much on Procopius. That yes, we gain a lot, but we also lose a lot. But when you pair that with your interest in looking at what he's doing at court rather than looking at what he's doing on the frontiers, I'm wondering if this has helped you rewrite not only the history of Justinian, but also the history of Theodora as well. Once you shed Procopius, and once you look at the court and who Justinian is and what he's hoping to do, and particularly since you're talking about the legal structures around marriage as well, I wanted to hear kind of what your revisions on how we talk about Justinian have, what implications they have for how we talk about Theodora. And then the other one... Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, go ahead, Peter, please.
I didn't talk about Theodora partly really due to time, because I think Theodora is such a fascinating character that she deserves to have a sort of lecture in her own right. Okay, what part of the Theodora narrative from Procopius do I think does stand scrutiny? Is that I am one of those who thinks that it looks entirely credible that early in her career she was forced into the sex trade. And I think, but one of the most fascinating aspects is that, Procopius says, Justinian is dominated by his wife, he consults her on matters of policy, he influences his laws. Well, she clearly does do those latter 2 things, because this is why I think actually looking at Theodora through the legislation is very interesting, and legislation in connection with Theodora. So in one of his laws, for example, on a purely administrative matter, to do with the sale of governorships, Justinian expressly says, and I consulted my wife on this, my consort, and then I consulted John the Cappadocian. And I think the sequencing of consultation is very interesting. And I think that in many ways, Justinian conceives of and represents his reign while she is alive as a period of joint rule between himself and Theodora, hence the way in which, for example, he demands, it is there in the legislation, that provincial governors swear oaths of loyalty to the 2 of them. The way in which in Hagia Sophia, as also in the Church of Sergius and Bacchus and other monuments, we have not Justinian's monograms, but also Theodora's monograms, ascribing these benefactions to her as well as to him. And I think with Justinian's legislation, there is a very persecutory side driven by his aggressively Christianizing instincts. And there is also a very charitable and philanthropic side, again, driven by the same instincts. And with respect to the latter, I think that we can see Theodora's influence most clearly at work. So I think we have very granular legislation detailing the crackdown on human traffickers, the crackdown on brothel keepers, the making it easier for women who want to improve themselves morally to escape life on the stage, for example, legislation making it easier for illegitimate children to be adopted, for neglected children to be looked after. And I think particularly that legislation on women on the stage, prostitution, the flesh trade, we're getting, as it were, the granularity of Theodora's own lived experience, and a really impressive aspect, that because clearly, once again, the claim that the Roman laws of marriage have to be amended to allow Justinian to marry Theodora, I think that stands up to scrutiny. So clearly she's lobbying to improve her own lot for herself, but also crucially, Theodora can be seen to be lobbying to improve the lot of women like her. And I think that makes her a really engaging and fascinating figure. And I think quite a lot of the more liberal end of Justinian's social legislation is informed by Theodora. And it's interesting looking at that then again from a more provincial background. As one of my students, Matt Hassel, has been looking at political debate in the age of Justinian, noted, for example, Justinian's legislation on attacking brothel keepers and trying to sort of save girls who have been trafficked into prostitution and what have you. In the legislation that we have it in the standard edition of the novels, yeah, it's in the emperor's name. In the Chronicle of John Malalas, that legislation is ascribed to Theodora. Now, of course, what we're seeing there is, I think, the way in which legislation may often be presented associated with the empress, particularly in areas with strong Miaphysite communities, given her own Miaphysite tendencies, and so as a point of contact there. But also, I think it's interesting that specific legislation is represented, is associated with her in an approving light in the Chronicle of Malalas. So how this legislation then being spun, the role of Theodora in presenting legislation, potentially in these provincial contexts, is, I think, quite interesting.
Okay, thank you for that, Peter. Scott, please come up and show your handsome face. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk, Peter. I was just curious, thinking about how meticulous Justinian is in so many things, and also how managed his succession was from Justin. I'm curious what you think about why he doesn't seem to have made as many kind of formal arrangements for his own succession. And there's a bit of a controversy about only one person sort of witnesses his naming of Justin II to the throne. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about his what you think is going on with his lack of succession arrangements, apparently.
Yeah, I think that, and I'm quite doubtful that he ever named Justin his successor. Actually, I think this is probably spin on the part of those around Justin II himself. I think it's very important to bear in mind that from the very start of the reign, Justinian is going to be subject to a series of ongoing conspiracies and attempted coups. Obviously, the most spectacular expression of this is the way in which the Nika riots are taken advantage of by anti-Justinianic elements at court to try to get rid of him. But there will be, ongoing plots and attempts on his life down into the early 560s, by which point he's a very old man. Yeah, and I think that, and indeed, it's striking that even his own uncle and adopted father, Justin I, he didn't immediately make Justinian his clearly nominated heir. Justinian has to machinate quite hard to get himself into that position. Now, I think if you are particularly if you're a childless, controversial ruler, you don't want there to be an obvious successor around whom hopes for regime change can coalesce. So I think it's a deliberate strategy that one also sees in other court societies. Again, I think that had there been an obvious successor, an obvious nominated successor, that would weaken Justinian's own political position at court. It's much better for him to keep people speculating, machinating against each other, and so on and so forth. So, and again, there are various. Former student of mine, Silvio Rojo, has written on this. There are indications, for example, that the future Emperor Justin II's circle are implicated in the conspiracy against Justinian of the early 560s. So it's and they try to deflect attention onto the household of Belisarius in that context. So I think the non-succession arrangements are a deliberate ploy to make him less vulnerable in the context of these coups and conspiracies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Nick, please bear with us because Francis Luis Figueroa Lozano, please excuse me if I have, pronounced it really wrongly. He has a question. While it is true that Emperor Justinian did not develop a specific local legal system focused exclusively on the production and distribution of silk in his kingdom, that is, he only introduced this production into the Byzantine Empire through industrial espionage. Could you explain to me how he broke the Eastern monopoly on this practice, especially with regard to Chinese and Persian production methods? Thanks.
Well, I'm afraid there we are there dependent on Procopius's, we largely depend on Procopius's claim that it is an act of industrial espionage whereby ecclesiastical spies or monastic spies have been used to steal the secret. Anna Mutasius would argue that by this point the Chinese have already lost their monopoly and that there is potentially within Sasanian Central Asia and former Sasanian Central Asia and in the Sasanian Empire there may be some domestic production. I don't agree with Anna Mutasius that there's evidence for it already being in Roman Syria by this point. So I do think that there is a genuine introduction under Justinian. But this ties in partly with your previous question you've asked about the trading dimensions to Roman Sasanian relations, because I do think that it's not so much a major issue in the warfare in Syria and the Caucasus. It is raised in the trade across the Caucasus is raised in the peace negotiations. And clearly one of the problems is that the Persians have a deliberate policy of trying to make the Romans dependent on Persian importation of silk and other high-value commodities from the East. And they've been long trying to do this by forcing as much of the trade as possible up the Persian Gulf and then through Persian territory. So the price controls, for example, that Justinian introduces on sale of silk, which we see in his legislation, is clearly an attempt to limit what he regards as the effects of Persian extortion through control of the silk industry. But I think that these rival attempts to control trade routes, with silk being one of the important commodities, is a very important factor in the proxy war over control of Himyar, with the Romans supporting the Ethiopian intervention in Himyar in the early 6th century, and with the Himyarite traders being regarded as operating in cahoots with the Romans, and the Romans trying to get trade up the Red Sea, and the Persians, as I've said, trying to put as much of it up the Persian Gulf as possible. But I think that's a struggle which the Persians are winning. I think by the end of the 6th century they've effectively won that, to all intents and purposes. Sorry, I can't hear you again. Sorry, you're on mute again.
Sorry. Jesus, I always do this. Okay, Nick, would you like to come up and pose your question?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for such a wonderful and thought-provoking talk. So you mentioned, Professor Sarris, about how Justinian's legal reforms had a really, really big influence on Christian Europe and in rethinking the relationships between rulers and their subjects. You also mentioned that this may have had an influence on the status of non-Muslims in the early caliphate. And I was wondering if you could say a few more words about the effect of Justinian's legal reforms on the Muslim world. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's, first of all, I think the issue, the relationship to sort of dimitude, as it were, is, I think, quite an interesting area for potential future research. I mean, going back to Patricia Kroner, there have long been, people have long sort of sought to tease out the extent to which Roman legal culture, what people used to think of as Roman provincial legal culture, I think that provincial aspect of it is now a bit suspect, but Roman legal culture influenced the development of social and legal institutions in the emergent Islamic world. Now, what Justinian is effectively doing is recasting Roman society, as I say, where in such a way as that those with the greatest rights are the Orthodox Christians, the apex of the pyramid, and then you have fewer social rights as you go down the pyramid. I think there are certain structural similarities there to dimitude as we'll find it taking shape in the lands of the Caliphate, other than, of course, it's going to be the Muslims that are at the apex of the pyramid. But I think what is sort of pushing one further in that direction, I think there is very interesting work coming out of authors such as I don't actually know how to pronounce his name. I've corresponded with him a lot. Juan Coles or Juan Coles in the US, and also Holger Zellentin in Germany, and my colleague Andy Marsham in Cambridge, teasing out what looks at very strong similarities, for example, between Justinianic legislation and early Islamic criminal punishment and again legislation on morality. So I think there's very interesting work emergent from Arabists looking at this. Right, as I say, it seems to be teasing out quite a lot of Justinianic legal influence within that nascent Islamic world. This ties in with an argument I made when I was working primarily on the novels. But I think there's a lot of quite well-informed Justinianic Roman law in operation in provincial settings. So if you take a look at Egypt, even when someone like Dioscorus Aphrodito is engaging in a private dispute resolution, the thinking of the private dispute resolution is often quite technically informed by aspects of contemporary imperial law. I think there's a lot more Justinianic Roman law in circulation in these provincial contexts, and that's why the inheritance into the Islamic world, I think, may be significant. Also important recent work in relation to the West. And I say that the idea of a rediscovery of Roman law is something which has to be rather nuanced in the West. One thing that has become increasingly clear is that there seems to be a functioning school of Justinianic Roman law in operation, probably under papal management, as it were, operating in Rome down to at least the 8th century. Now that is Roman law down in the pre-11th century period is primarily, as it were, the law of Justinian's novels, as transmitted through the epitome of Julian, what have you. But there seems to be once again actually a school of Justinianic Roman law operating in Italy down to the 8th century, and that I think is very important for how we also understand the diffusion and embedding of aspects of Justinianic modes of thought and legal practice.
Thank you so much.
So, Peter, first of all, Francis Lewis says, thanks for this remarkable answer. And Patrick Skupniewicz says that interesting lecture, thank you. And he had to leave. But I'm very, very happy to bring Ava Navai to the fore. Ava, please, I want to see you. Ava? Okay, good. So, Ava, ask your question.
Again, I can't hear. Sorry.
I'm muted and you're muted. I'm not muted anymore. Ava, you're muted. Or would you like me to just read for you?
I think it's okay now. Do you hear me?
Great. Yes, yes, yes. Yes. The connection is. Yeah.
I was wondering if Justinian's emphasis on Christianity was based on an honest belief in theological belief, or it was a policy. I mean, actually, a political policy to define a strong, unique identity to survive and also have more strength in the region at the time.
Right, so I think that there are clearly aspects of Justinian's religious policy where his religious policy is being weaponized for political purposes other than simply trying to secure divine favor. So, for example, as the late John Boswell emphasized, it's perhaps interesting that the only people we know by name to have been punished, I think, in Justinian's crackdown on homosexual acts were bishops. That, if you want to get rid of an unmarried man who's politically problematic, the allegation of homosexuality can be quite useful, just as the allegation of paganism against highly educated members of the Senate can be quite politically useful. So I'm not saying that he never weaponizes things for ulterior purposes. However, I think it is absolutely fundamental to bear in that I think if one reads the material, what really comes across is that Justinian is personally fascinated with the minutiae of theology in a way that is very unusual, and that the only conclusion I've come to is that this is his character and this is his mind, and he's deeply interested in it. And one can see, as it were, that his religious policy evolves as a process of thought, and one assumes belief as well. So the example would be, for example, when he is engaging in discussion with Pope Hormisdas before he is emperor, he's letting him know that there are some monks on their way to Rome in the context of the ongoing Chalcedonian dispute, who are proposing a way of trying to sort of navigate the theological problems through developing what's known as sort of a theopaskite doctrine. And Justinian says, these people are coming to speak to you with no official standing, don't listen to them, be very suspicious of them. They're associated with one of his potential rivals for the throne down the line, which may be, so again, there may be a political dimension there. But what's then interesting is that within a matter of just a couple of weeks, he's changed his mind on theopaskism and seems to think and starts thinking it has sort of theological legs and potentially provides a means of actually getting around the theological complexities tied up with the Chalcedonian dispute. So he writes in a couple of weeks later saying, actually, this doctrine has some potential to it, blah, blah, blah. And that seed then is planted in his mind, and we can see that growing in his own doctrinal positions and the way in which he is then seeking to advance and refine theopaskite doctrine in a way that finds fullest efflorescence at the Council of Constantinople in 553. So I think in relation to that doctrine, we see his mind at work. And I say down to the end of his reign, he's reaching out to these figures such as the Julianists, as it were, over quite obtruse Aphthartist doctrine. I think this is, he's not the only emperor who's interested in theology. So Anastasius, his uncle's predecessor Anastasius, on ascending the throne, had to swear an oath to the Patriarch of Constantinople that he would not issue religious statements because his theology was regarded as being a bit suspect, as he was a bit too pro the dissidents. But I think Justinian is genuinely personally fascinated by doctrine, as well as I say, instrumentalizing religious policy for other purposes in other contexts.
Thank you. And can I ask another little question?
Sure.
Do you know his approach towards Gnostics at the time? I mean, in his law, is there anything about Gnostics?
There's nothing about Gnostics in particular. I mean, he does crack, they're not Gnostics, but he is associated with a purge of, I think, sort of playing to his more hardline support base within the church. He does crack down on more heavily intellectualized followers of Origen in the church, particularly in Palestine. So it's not Gnosticism per se, but it is sort of highly intellectualized elements within the church on that are cracked down on. Good discussion of that by Richard Price in his commentary on the Council of 553, which I'd recommend.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ava.
Thank you, Parvane.
You're welcome. Peter, a question that I was on follow-up for Ava's question. First of all, I want to tell Ava that Avajan, this business of Islamic, hegemonic laws over populations, as far as Iran is concerned, was really never really implemented, as far as I'm concerned, until the Safavids. So in that connection, I was wondering, Peter, whether these pagans that you're talking about, about up until 14th century, Hafez is still talking about the Moors and Kharabat, and he's completely Mithraic. So, Peter, I was wondering, have you come across any hint of Mithraism in these pagan, because you're talking about them going underground and whatnot?
I don't. You would have to speak to the Oxford Archaeological team about the fine details of what they found there. I can't remember which deities were found, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we're waiting for more questions because they're not that often. It's not that often that we will have you with us. So any more questions from the audience? No. Okay. Peter, is there anything else you want to add? Some of us, I am especially interested in the East Rome Persian connection.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And the fact that, for instance, Khosrow's reforms, as far as I'm concerned, were never successful.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they kind of led to the resentment of the aristocracy, Parthian aristocracy, and were basically one of the causes of the downfall, quote unquote, downfall of the Sasanians, because Sasanians did not downfall altogether. The north remains intact. It was kind of responsible for the downfall of the Sasanians with the so-called Arab conquest. So, but that does not seem to be the case with Justinian, right?
Well, I would say that the similarity is that Justinian's agenda of domestic reform, in particular, his attempts to upgrade the fiscal machinery of the Roman state, crack down on tax evasion by members of the elite in particular, does of course raise political tensions between his regime and members of the not all members of the aristocracy, but significant elements of the aristocracy. And they'll then also tie that in with the culture wars of the period, which are often irritating the same people as well. So I think that there is, this is an era of heightened social tensions in which Justinian's domestic agenda is helping to raise those tensions and raising, in particular, as I say, tensions between the imperial government and members of the aristocracy. Okay. Now, and I think that would be similar to what you would be arguing with respect to Khosrow's reforms. What happens then is, as it were, that in the reign of Justin II, you have a great rapprochement between those self-same aristocratic interests and the Roman government, as it were. And Justin II sort of reaches out to those elements much more. But that, I think, then raises a different set of social tensions in a different way. Because one of the crucial things I would argue is that in the advent of the first advent of the bubonic plague, in the medium term, the sort of labour shortages that have arisen in response to that have allowed for a considerable improvement in the lot of poorer sections of East Roman society, those who sell their labour, craftsmen, the urban poor agricultural workers. There's a sort of, let's say, in a situation we also encounter, say, in late medieval England in the context of the Black Death in the late 14th century, rising per capita income, greater standards of living, that in the context of that rapprochement between Justin II and landowning interests and aristocratic interests, we also see an attempt to roll back those gains in standards of living made by members of the working population in the context of the aftermath of the bubonic plague. So I think the Roman Near East in the late 6th century, through a combination of Justinian's reform and through a combination of Justin II's attempt to roll back those gains in living standards resulting from the bubonic plague, I think is a world of heightened social tensions, and those heightened social tensions are part of the backstory to Khusro II's successful invasions.
Mm-hmm. Was it in any way related to the medieval sort of social structure, what you're explaining, medieval social structure that rose in Europe, the so-called feudal arrangements?
No, not directly. I mean, I think that as it were, the part of what makes the East Roman state structurally very vulnerable in the context of sudden shifts in the population, as it were, or sudden drops in the population, is its fiscal system. So the less fiscalized a society, I think the less structurally unstable it's likely to become when faced with that sort of external shock. Which is why I think that we get less sort of structural instability in the less fiscalized societies that have emerged by this point in the early medieval West.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was fascinating, Peter. I cannot begin to thank you. I mean, I urge my colleagues, if they have a question, if they have questions, this would be the last chance. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Lovely to meet you almost in the flesh at last. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.